banal versions of multiculturalism in Europe.
Yes.
Repeat the question, Ken.
Sure.
Adrian's question was about what the slaughter recently of Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh would portend for the possibility of neoconservatism in Europe, as particularly it exposes the Achilles heel of multiculturalism among Europeans.
Yes, absolutely. I think you are entirely right. And actually the reaction in the Netherlands and in other places has been precisely in that direction, saying that actually the platitudes of multiculturalism are completely misguided, and we have to be able to reassert our own Western tradition and be proud of it, especially at two very important points, not only to reassert them, but to be proud of them. And actually, I think that that has been another very important and well, tragic in this case, event that took place after the book was written. And I think he is already reinforcing what we might call neoconservative dispositions in Europe. Thank you.
I just add a word on that. I mean, since Chris Caldwell, my colleague at the Weekly Standard, wrote a big story on what was going on in Holland, and I've been trying to follow Europe a little bit in the last few years, especially the few months. When one talks to Europeans, I mean, neoconservatism is not, as many people in this book explain, is very much an American phenomenon, and one can make lots of arguments for why it, in a way, perhaps couldn't have been a European phenomenon, or at least in a political sense. Intellectually, of course, it's a European phenomenon as much as America, and the thinkers, neoconservative cite some of their favorite thinkers, in fact, are some of the greatest European thinkers of the last 2, 3, 4 centuries. The Montesquieu, Tocqueville, Burke, strain of liberalism is those are Europeans, not or at least Europeans and Englishmen, I guess at the time. I'm not sure if they were Europeans, not Americans, but if you talk, it probably couldn't have grown up politically, I suspect, in contemporary Europe. The question is it possible to imagine a neoconservative moment in Europe today? And I'd say most Europeans I talk to are doubtful, because they're in the middle of it and they know how lonely it is to be a neoconservative journalist, or, I mean, I use neoconservative sort of in quotation marks there, a journalist who's inclined in this direction, or certainly a political figure inclined in this direction. But it seems to me, looking at it from more of a distance, I mean, I wonder whether it couldn't be a moment in Europe somewhat similar to the late 60s or early 70s here, where traditional conservatism has really has fallen apart to some degree, or mutated into very unpleasant movements which no one, sensible and decent really wants to embrace. The European project seems much less confident, I would say, in its future, both in practical ways and also at some deeper theoretical level, and that's what João was referring to, I think, than it certainly was 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. And one does get the sense, I get the sense personally, I just may be kidding myself and very selective in who I talk to, but among younger Europeans, including lots of liberals, not so much traditional conservatives, there is a kind of rethinking that, for me, is somewhat reminiscent of the rethinking that went on when I was quite young and before I was engaged much even in America among many liberals. Is the sort of end of history dream of the EU, of the European project, almost beyond politics, is that really possible? And if not, without going somehow back to 19th century Europe, which isn't going to happen and shouldn't happen, is there sort of another way? So I think it's an interesting question as to whether things couldn't change much more than we now expect in Europe, whether you couldn't have a sort of quasi-neoconservative developments, movements, thinkers, arguments in lots of the European countries over the next few years.
I would like to make one short comment and a question. My comment is concerning the Buttiglione affair. I think that Mr. Buttiglione wasn't the problem that he's a conservative, but the problem was that he made 2 mistakes during his hearing, 2 humiliating comments concerning women and gays, and after these comments he wouldn't be able to become a member even of the U.S. government after a Senate hearing if he would have made these comments in the U.S. Senate. And my question is that during the first Bush administration, we saw, at least at the beginning, a quite combative neoconservatism. And now you are talking about inclusiveness of this idea. My question is that whether we will see during the second Bush administration a neocon soft version.
Let me repeat the question. Yes, this is the correspondent for Hagiar magazine, and his comments. First, he had a brief comment on the Buttiglione affair, and he said that Buttiglione made two, and I quote here, humiliating comments. One with regard to gays, one with regard to women that prevented him from being, would have prevented him from being confirmed in his position in the United States had he been before the U.S. Senate. And then the second question was, will we see the emergence of a, or the question was, will we see the emergence of a softer version of neoconservatism as the Bush administration seems to be taking a more inclusive attitude towards foreign policy?
Let me take a quick crack at that. On the first part, I think he very carefully distinguished his personal religious views from what he would do about enforcing the law, which has a pertinence here in the judiciary fights, the judicial appointment fights that we're going to have. But second of all, this is a very European notion that somehow there's great hope that they'll have a softer, kinder George W. Bush to deal with in the second term. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think he may have more problems with the Congress than in the first term. That's certainly true. But there isn't a single sign that either on domestic policy, tax cuts, on which he's taking a beating, Social Security, which he's taking a beating from myself included, or on foreign policy, where the pressure was to postpone the elections or do something different in Iraq, or fire Rumsfeld. I mean, half of Europe would have been quite happy with just that, not to mention my friend over here. I don't see any of that happening. I don't see the faintest sign of that now. You know, Bill knows these people better than I do, but certainly from the policy positions, from the public statements, I think what people don't understand is that they're dealing with a conviction politician. They're dealing with an American version of Margaret Thatcher, who's a conviction politician. They're not dealing with somebody who is taking polls. Now, is he a practical politician? Sure. Did he want to get elected? Certainly. But you can't think of anything, even in the campaign, where it would have been really handy to back down on a couple of things where that happened. And I think the thing that startles Europeans so much is that there is such a thing as a conviction politician. That's why Tony Blair's position in Iraq comes as such a jarring experience for continental Europeans. He has a moral conviction that this is the right thing to do. He's certainly not doing it for political advantage. And I think Europeans have great difficulty wrapping their heads around the notion that this breed exists in politics, since the people they see most in the headlines are the likes of Jacques Chirac.
I mean, the one thing I would add is I think we'll see perhaps different, a more tactful administration with respect to Europe, especially in the second term. I mean, there were failures of public diplomacy, no question. Irwin wrote about them in our magazine. With regard to Europe, we would have still disagreed on a lot of things, but we certainly didn't do a good job of making our case. You could make the argument that in the first term we had, in a way, the worst of both worlds. We had a president and Secretary of Defense, vice president, who were very forthright in stating their views, which was fine. We had a State Department that didn't agree with those views and therefore made no attempt to even convince Europeans, no attempt that I could see, to convince most European elites or the European people, the people of the European nations, that, you know, these views, even if they didn't agree with them, were not crazy, that they were thought out, that there was a judgment underlying them that was at least worth listening to. I do think we will have a better, simply a better executed foreign policy in the second term with Condoleezza Rice running the State Department. I know she's concerned about this. I know she believes, and she's not an equivocator in any way. She's also a conviction politician or political figure or leader, but that she believes we can simply do a much better job of making our case. So I think in that respect, there'll be perhaps some differences in tone and differences in effort at making the case than there were in the first term. But I very much agree that if you just look at the president's interviews in the last week, he's absolutely committed to the fundamental project of winning the war on terror, beginning the transformation of the Middle East, dealing with the threat of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. There's no sign that he's fundamentally changed his mind about how to do that. There are always these tactical questions of what to do about particular nations at particular times and what mix of diplomacy and economic pressure and military threat have to be used. I would come back to this when I was in Europe, actually, in November, I think it was, of 2003. The president announced at that point the planned Iraqi transfer of power to the new Iraqi government, which was then announced that it would happen at the end of June in 2004, and it did happen, of course. There was not a single European I talked to, and very few American liberals, I would say as well, who didn't believe that this was code for an exit strategy. Bush was getting out. Karl Rove had told the president, you cannot go to the electorate with what was then about 120,000 troops in Iraq, fighting a nasty insurgency, taking casualties, very uncertain future. And I remember being, slightly worried myself for a day or two. You hear this 50 times in a day. You're not sure. But I called back to D.C., and I was reassured, and I never really doubted it, that the president was there, that this was part of, as Conte later put it to me, this was part of a victory strategy, not an exit strategy. We needed the transfer of power to make victory more possible, not to get ourselves out. I said this to the Europeans. They thought I was just parroting Bush administration propaganda. But to the president's credit, and he really does deserve credit on this for this, no matter what one's views of whether we should have gone to war in Iraq, and no matter what one's views of how badly the immediate post-invasion phase was bungled and other mistakes that were made, and I do think pretty serious mistakes were made, he really deserves credit for this. He went to the American people with 125,000 troops in the field in Iraq, fighting, not, retreating to barracks, with no promises of withdrawal. No, Clinton said in '95 we'll go into Bosnia, well, they'll all be out in a year, and he knew they wouldn't be, but he felt he had to say it politically. Nothing like that. No promise to be out in a year. No promise even that we would draw down troops within a year, with every prospect of the fighting continued. And in that respect, I think he showed very unusual political courage, and I think that is, having won the election, having shown this political courage and not having backed off, it seems to me very unlikely that he's now going to decide, oh great, now I've been reelected, having taken this huge risk and having stood up for what I think is right and not equivocating much politically. Now I'm going to suddenly sort of rethink everything and bow to the pressure of op-ed pages or of chiding from some allies who have differences. So I think the fundamental lines of Bush's foreign policy won't change.
Joe, did you want to?
Yes, I agree with the previous speakers. I just would like to go back to the question, the first part of the question, actually the comment. I don't want to engage in a full discussion about Rocco Buttiglione, but I'd just like to say 2 or 3 things. First, I read the transcript of all the interviews with Buttiglione in the European Parliament. I couldn't see any humiliating remarks. And I could, of course, see several particular moral views of his, but no humiliating remarks. And again, as Mr. Selzer said, he was very keen on distinguishing his moral views from the law and what he was going to do under the law. A funny question might be about why did all these people ask him questions about his moral views when they usually don't ask those questions to other people. That's an interesting point. Second, Buttiglione actually wrote a short piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago, saying that in Europe, neither George Bush nor John Kerry would be perceived as fit for office because they would be perceived as too conservative. And I think Rocco Buttiglione has a point there. And finally, the main point I was making, and I would like to make again, is not about the particular views of people about what Rocco Buttiglione thinks or doesn't think. That's not my point. My point is about the mismatch, the huge mismatch between what these European so-called officers and what I call the supranational elite thinks and what common people think. And my question is, why on earth should, in a free society, the views of a particular group be imposed over the little platoons? That's my question. That was my question, and it is still my question. Thank you.
Yeah. Tom Duesterberg at the moment.
Tom Duesterberg, Manufacturers Alliance. I'd like to follow up on this discussion of Europe a little bit more. Mr. Espada, maybe Erwin would like to comment as well. A lot of the critique that you've made of the supranational elites in the European Union